Imagine trying to build a superpower totally from scratch. Well, welcome to this explainer, where we're going to unpack the incredible cinematic story of how the United States was drafted on paper and then carved into an entire continent. We're going to explore the absolutely critical decisions that shaped a brand new nation and the relentless momentum that pushed its borders all the way across the map. So, you really have to wonder, how exactly did we go from a fragile, barely holding it together group of 13 states to a sprawling, coast-to-coast superpower? Well, it is a wild journey full of intense debates, vast wilderness, and some pretty rapid technological leaps. Let's dive right in. To figure that out, here is our roadmap. We'll go from Confederation to Constitution, look at the features of the Republic, cover the Federalists versus Anti-Federalists, trace the drive out west, and finally hit the golden frontier. Starting off with Section 1, from Confederation to Constitution. We're rewinding to 1787. You see, the initial plan for the U.S., the Articles of Confederation, was just way too weak. It couldn't even collect taxes or keep the peace during crises like Shays' Rebellion. The founders were terrified of a strong central government like they had under Britain, but they quickly realized that a government with zero power was honestly just as dangerous. Right out of the gate, a bitter clash erupted in Philadelphia over who would actually hold the power in this new Congress. You had the large states pushing hard for the Virginia Plan, wanting representation based on population so they'd have more influence. But the smaller states? No way. They fiercely backed the New Jersey Plan, demanding equal representation for every state so they wouldn't just be completely overshadowed. And that is where the Great Compromise comes in. Crafted by Roger Sherman, this was a brilliant fix that balanced everyone's demands. It split Congress right down the middle into a bicameral legislature. So you get a Senate where every state has equal representation and a House of Representatives based entirely on population. It was literally the only way to save the whole convention from falling apart. But to keep the southern states at the table, the delegates also reached a much darker compromise. They agreed to count each enslaved person as 3/5 of a person for the sake of representation. This structurally embedded slavery into the nation's foundation from day one, and as we know, it foreshadowed the immense, devastating conflicts that were to come. Moving right along to Section 2, Features of the Republic. With those massive compromises settled, the framers finalized a document that is fundamentally unique in global history. They built this new republic on 7 core pillars, things like popular sovereignty and federalism. By uniquely separating the executive power from the legislature and dividing authority between the national government and the states, they created a system where no single branch, not the president, not Congress, and not the courts, could ever completely dominate the others. It's like a giant, very careful balancing act. And get this, the world's oldest written national constitution is incredibly short. It's just 4,000 words. You could sit down and read this entire, highly rigid legal framework in about half an hour. It is exceptionally concise, yet somehow it's managed to adapt and survive for well over 2 centuries. Section 3, Federalists versus Anti-Federalists. Drafting the blueprint was obviously huge, but getting the American people to actually accept it, that sparked one of the fiercest ideological debates in history. This brought out the core political divide of the entire era. In one corner, you had the Federalists. These were mostly coastal merchants who wanted a strong central government. In the other corner, the Anti-Federalists. These were often Western farmers who were terrified of a new tyranny, and they fiercely demanded states' rights and protections for individual liberties. To convince a very skeptical public, heavy hitters like Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay went into overdrive. They frantically wrote and published an incredible 85 essays, which we now call the Federalist Papers. They meticulously defended every single major provision of the new Constitution, arguing that this new government was not just safe, but highly practical. Ultimately, though, the Anti-Federalists held their ground and won a major concession, the Bill of Rights. They ensured that individual liberties were explicitly protected in exchange for their support. Honestly, without the promise of these first 10 amendments guarding freedoms like speech and religion, freedoms we still rely on today, the Constitution probably never would have been ratified. Which brings us to Section 4, the drive out west. So the rules are locked in. George Washington is setting all these crucial precedents, and the nation's gaze suddenly turns away from Europe and looks out toward the sprawling continent. The blueprint was done. Now they had to build out the borders. A lot of this was fueled by manifest destiny. This was the deeply ingrained 19th century belief that the nation was literally preordained to expand its borders across the entire continent. This mindset totally transformed the U.S. from a small coastal republic into a highly aggressive, expansionist power that was just hungry for land. And man, the map was redrawn so fast. Just look at this timeline. Between diplomats, massive purchases, and wars, the borders were systematically pushed all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Strategic annexations and conflicts, like the Mexican-American War, brought immense swaths of new territory right under the American flag in just a few decades. For example, Thomas Jefferson essentially pulled off the real estate deal of the millennium. He doubled the entire size of the country for just $15 million by buying the Louisiana Territory from France. That one single purchase stretched the nation's boundaries from the Mississippi River all the way out to the Rocky Mountains. Now, it's really important to remember that this idea of an empty wilderness was a complete myth. This was land already inhabited by thousands of native tribes who had lived there for millennia. And that set the stage for decades of complex, violent clashes over who actually controlled the territory. The historical reality is that this relentless push westward resulted in strict government policies, like the 1830 Indian Removal Act. This forcibly displaced tens of thousands of Native Americans to Western lands, leading to immense suffering for nations like the Cherokee on the tragic Trail of Tears. This explosive expansion undeniably came at a profound cost to the continent's original inhabitants. And that leads us to our final act, Section 5, the Golden Frontier. The final push of this expansion wasn't just about land anymore. It was fueled by the glittering promise of untold wealth. Finding gold and resources accelerated migration in ways absolutely no one could have predicted. Just look at that number, 300,000. That is the explosive number of 49ers who flooded into California during the gold rush. It was an instant demographic transformation. This sudden, massive influx of people arriving from literally all over the world fast-tracked California's admission to the Union as a state. But the West wasn't just settled in chaos. It happened in distinct stages. First, you had solitary mountain men exploring the rivers, then brave pioneers taking on the wagon trails. That evolved into a highly organized network of boom towns and ranches. And finally, the transcontinental railroads connecting it all. It was a step-by-step unlocking of the continent. Then came the real game changer. Driving that final railroad spike at Promontory Summit effectively conquered the geography of the U.S. It shrank what used to be a deadly 6-month trek on a wagon trail into a simple 1-week train ride. The railroad, right alongside the telegraph, bound this newly expanded nation together and solidified the federal government's reach from coast to coast. So I'll leave you with this to ponder. With the wild frontier officially closed and a rigid constitution now uniting two oceans, how would this new continental giant wield its incredible power in the 20th century? A nation that started as a fragile little compromise in Philadelphia had grown into an absolute industrial juggernaut. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep exploring.